We know that two-thirds of people to recover from addiction do so through an awakening of spiritual life. And we know that a teen with a strong spirituality is at 80% decreased relative risk for addiction to drugs and alcohol. So there is something incredibly important here that we need to support in young people before they bottom out.
From the offices of the Weill Cornell Medicine Brain and Spine Center in New York City, this is Your Brain with Dr. Phil Stieg. Internationally renowned scientist and researcher, Dr. Phil Stieg is neurosurgeon-in-chief of the New York Presbyterian Weill Cornell Medical Center. This week, Dr. Stieg and his guest explore engaging your spiritual core.
Hello, I'd like to welcome Dr. Lisa Miller, professor of clinical psychology at Columbia University, as well as founder and director of the Spirituality Mind-Body Institute. She is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Spiritual Child, and her 2021 book, The Awakened Brain, The New Science of Spirituality and Our Quest for an Inspired Life. Let's learn how a spiritual life, that is, a walk in nature, reading a sacred text, saying a prayer, or a traditional religious basis for life, can have positive impact on your health. Lisa, thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm absolutely delighted to be joining you, Dr. Stieg.
I want to ask you, what was your goal? What did you want to achieve in writing The Awakened Brain?
I wrote The Awakened Brain so that everyone could see that suffering is not lost time or downtime, but very often depression is a knock at the door to an awakening of a deeper, more meaningful, more loving life. I think midlife crisis is a developmental gift, and it's no way out of it, and a developmental imperative. The type of pain and despair that we feel at midlife, that is a growth process that helps us. We are better in the end. We are being prepared to inherit the mantle of our next decade.
So that's what you wanted to achieve with The Awakened Brain, is how to go through those episodes of depression, how to approach them in a more constructive manner. What do you mean by, quote, the awakened brain?
If we are religious, whether we're Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, Catholic, Christian, we all have the same neurodocking station, if you will, for our awakened brain to see, what is life showing me now? Where is my compass pointing me? And even more importantly, how do I engage and find deeper, more true direction in my life? And we are hardwired to be able to do that. We can engage our awakened brain, our capacity to see into a deeper presence in life.
In the introduction to your book, you give some compelling statistics as to why the awakened brain is so important. It was overwhelming to me, the problem that we're having in America right now.
So it is now the case in every decade of life that depression, addiction, and even suicide is at an all-time high that weighs on every decade of life, but it is most burdensome upon the emerging adult and late adolescent. The rate of death by suicide in a young adult now rivals the rate of death by auto accident. That has never been the case, never. And, if you were to think of a dystopic horror film, it would be one in which people come of age, and right when they're about to launch, they feel empty, despair, there's no hope, and they kill themselves. That is a dystopic horror film, and we're living it. So why? It is not because of outward events. It is because of the atrophy of our awakened awareness, the shift in our ability to engage our awakened awareness, to not look narrowly at ourselves as being knocked around by a random, cruel world, but to realize that there's a deeper connection into life that we are hardwired to see, feel, and perceive, and to use that. So, 40 years ago, people used their awakened brain. It was, at that point, generally cultivated through the broad range of faith traditions. There's other ways it can be cultivated, but 40 years ago, that was the predominant way through which our awakened awareness was cultivated. And in the good attempt to be inclusive, we threw all religion out of the public square, which turned out not to be so inclusive, but actually radically exclusive, to the point where we have a completely spiritually non-conversant society. People don't really know how to talk about this.
So let's talk about awakening our awareness. Please define spirituality and how that differs and is similar to a formal religion.
Awakened awareness is our natural birthright. It is a capacity of perception through which we are an open system instead of thinking that we control all of life. Sometimes we don't even know this till we don't get what we want, like we lose our business or my lover leaves me. You know, when we don't get what we want, we realize, wait a minute, can I really control everything? Awakened awareness starts with the principle that we actually do not control everything. We are an open system in dialogue with a living universe, with a living world. So we can stop asking the question, did I get what I want? What else do I want? Why didn't I get what I wanted? And instead look more deeply with our eyes and open our heart and say, what is life showing me now? What is being asked of me now? And that can be through the flow of life itself. For many of us, it is through a felt relationship with a higher power. I use the word God. For some people, it's a unitive sense, a sense of being one with all of nature or all life. But whatever we conceptualize as the ultimate source of the universe, we are in a relationship, a felt, dynamic relationship with the deeper force of life. And that relationship is not just anything. We've asked people across all traditions, and what we hear, no matter where they are from on the face of the globe, is that this deep, transcendent relationship is loving and holding. It is guiding, and we are never alone.
When should a person look in the mirror and say, ooh, I'm not leading a life that will lead me to being awakened?
When I go to bed at night and I think, wow, I really wasted today. I did about 47 errands, 2/3 of them online. You know, I booked my ticket and I organized the hotel, and those things need to be done. But when I've treated today purely functionally and not deeply engaged in the miracle and the presence of the moving river, the sun sparkling on the ice. People say, what's the opposite of being spiritual? It's not being atheist. The opposite of being spiritual is being radically human-centered, that somehow my appetites and desires are the most important part of the whole world.
If I am becoming so radically self-centered, I would say, whoa, I need to take a step back. What are those metrics? I spend all my time thinking about myself. I spend all my time on social media. I'm trying to help people realize that they should say, time to step back and cultivate whatever form of spiritual life is for them.
Beautiful, Phil. And I want to highlight something in that statement, which is it's not the case that there's spiritual people who are good and self-centered people who are bad, but that rather both appetites are in both of us. And the goal is actually to bring our capacity to achieve into service for our more profound capacity to walk a spiritual path, that the head is really only there to implement and serve the deep truth, the guidance of the heart. Every single human being is born a spiritual being. We know that in science through twin studies, through MRI studies. Just as much as we're physical and emotional and cognitive, we are spiritual. It's our birthright. But then how do we build it? That's by choice. That's by practice. That's by the way we treat other people and how we pray and meditate and the values we keep.
So let's look at the science that underlies your work. How did you really determine that there's a therapeutic benefit to spirituality?
Yes, so Phil, for easily a decade, we used every form of observational study that you could find in a medical school. We used long-term clinical course studies, high-risk studies, population-based, and no matter what form of epidemiology we used, we could see a profound protective benefit of spirituality against depression. And we could also see that through the struggle of depression, a deeper spirituality could be formed that then forthcoming was protective against the next bout. So that there was a deep relationship between spirituality and depression, one in which through suffering, spirituality is awakened and strengthened, And once strengthened, spirituality protects against the next downward spiral because it opens up our deeper understanding of life. We saw that loud and clear. And yet somehow, despite dozens of peer-reviewed articles on this deep protective benefit of spirituality against depression, we didn't see the field shifting. We didn't see a proliferation of new therapies. We didn't see training programs. Somehow things weren't moving. It seemed to me that in order to make treatment change, in order to really help to see spirituality as central to mental health and wellness, that we actually needed brain studies, because the bottom line was an assumption that if you can show it in the brain, it therefore is real. If the human has a MRI conducted that shows, look at the change in the brain around depression, then depression's real and we treat it. Well, that study hadn't been run yet on spirituality. So it seemed that the way to go was to help us as researchers, but ultimately in time the field, understand spirituality as part of the brain.
What specifically were the MRI findings that you got?
We looked through the MRI at people with a sustained spiritual life over 8 years. And what we found were broad regions of cortical thickness. The cortex, is processing power. Broad regions of cortical thickness across the parietal, precuneus, and occipital. Regions of perception and reflection and orientation. And in particular, we saw the thick cortex across the regions of the awakened brain. But what was most remarkable is that those regions were not thick, but thin in people with recurrent major depression. So finally, we had seen the neuroanatomical correlates of spirituality as protective against depression. And when we sent that off to JAMA, they said, great study, but they wrote back with a follow-up. They said, what about, nice thick cortex today across the regions of the awakened brain? What does that say about how we're doing a year from now? Can you make prospective claims? And indeed, it turned out that cortical thickening across the regions of the awakened brain was protective against depressive symptoms a year out, which offered some of the first evidence that sustained spiritual life may be neuroprotective against depression.
So I have to ask then, thinking about the agnostic or the atheist, if you did a functional MRI on their brain, is it different than the spiritual brain?
So it could well be, Phil, that they still are deeply engaged as an open system.
So they're hardwired, but they're not using the wires.
They may not be fully using it, but oftentimes underneath the no, not me, I don't believe in anything, is a walk the walk of spiritual engagement. Very often there is a deep service. Very often there's a connection and care for fellow living beings or nature. Very often they are still an open system. What defines awakened awareness is that we are not closed and hermetic. We are open and engaged with the force of life. So there are people out there walking the walk of awakened awareness who may not own it yet. And yes, it would be furthered and deepened if they did. But the opposite of spirituality, the opposite of being awakened, is not atheist. It's being solipsistic, anthropocentric, thinking that we humans as a closed system control how everything's going to roll out on Earth.
You also said that spirituality was protective with adolescent drug utilization.
We know that through AA and NA, 2/3 of people to recover from addiction do so through an awakening of spiritual life, some spontaneously and some through chipping away at it. And we know through a nationally representative sample that a teen with a strong spirituality who says, my personal spiritual life is highly important to me, is at 80% decreased relative risk for addiction to drugs and alcohol. We published this in the Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. This is total peer-reviewed science. It's not just a hope of a mom. So there is something incredibly important here that we need to support in young people before they bottom out. Why do we wait for them to bottom out to say, oh, you know what? You can hand it over. You can have a transcendent relationship. Well, we were wired for that from the day we were born. Let's help them soon, now.
Listeners to This Is Your Brain are invited to sign up for our email newsletter. Get advance notice of future episodes, as well as access to fascinating bonus material from past episodes exclusive to newsletter subscribers. Sign up today at thisisyourbrain.com.
The problem I have is if you take a survey, 70% of Americans will say that they're either spiritual or religious. But then what you're noticing is that we're not. We're into achieving awareness, but we're not accepting it and incorporating it into our lives. So where's the disconnect? What's going on?
I teamed up with my colleague Sunga Luther. Sunga Luther had looked at kids in poverty for a decade. And simply for a control group, she put together some high schools in highly resourced communities outside New York, outside San Francisco. And Dr. Luther found higher rates of depression, addiction, anxiety in the affluent suburbs than in the inner city. So I teamed up with her. I said, let's look at spirituality in highly resourced communities. It turned out that the rate at which a young person says my spirituality is highly important to me is about 70%. Well, when you go into highly resourced communities, the rate at which a young person said spirituality is highly important to me is less than a quarter of the national rate. It is 15%. 15%, less than a quarter of the national rate of those kids feel connected to God, spirit, nature, force. And we know through 20 years of published peer-reviewed science that that personal connection is more protective against addiction, depression, suicide than anything in the clinical sciences. There is nothing else that is 80% protective against addiction. There is nothing else that is 82% protective against completed suicide. So I would say that the greatest pain that we're finding amongst Gen Z is particularly loaded into communities that have acculturated young people out of their awakened awareness.
So do you feel like John the Baptist? You're out in the wilderness telling people to wake up and find their inner awareness? It seems to me you're losing the battle if you look at the statistics.
You know, Phil, when I speak with parents, when I'm in the communities that are suffering from low levels of awakened awareness, communities that have not honored spirituality as important to their daily lives, I share the science. I just put it up there. And parents really pay attention. They say, you know, this speaks to the left side of my brain long enough that I can open up other parts of my heart. And they start to cry. They start to cry. And the question that when their hand shoots up real high from parents is actually not about their child. It's about them. And they'll say, am I spiritual?
What can I do as a parent to facilitate a fully actualized spiritual life, an awakening within my child's spirit?
Phil, in my book, The Spiritual Child, I get into this in a great deal of depth, but I'll highlight the things that I think are immediately actionable. And the first is that as parents, we are open and transparent about our own spiritual life. So for instance, if I can tell my child right now at a liberal arts college, you know, when I was a sophomore, I really wondered, does God exist? Is this a random universe? I questioned everything I'd ever learned, and I really took seriously that love wasn't real, that we were nothing but passing blips. And I got so depressed that I ended up spending half my sophomore year in the basement near the water heater, so I would just sort of seek warmth away from the cruelty of that painful thought. And
I thought that was just being at Yale. Yeah.
That speaks to my child's own existential walk. So I can't lift her up like when she was 4 out of the tree and say, nope, there's spirit. See, you actually are connected. She has to find it. But I can walk by her side, I can hear her, and in the transparency of my coming of age, my story of adult spiritual individuation, she can see that it's real, that there's light at the end of the tunnel. Foremost, that we talk about this here, and our relationship goes to that depth. So the most important thing we can do as parents to support our child's own spiritual growth is to be open and forthcoming about our own spiritual lives.
Considering where you're going with all of this, I was reading the article written about the Spiritual Readiness Initiative with the U.S. Army. Tell me a little bit about what you're doing there.
This has been the great honor and gift of my whole career, being able to have contributed to our country in this way, sharing the science in the awakened brain on our innate capacity for spirituality and when it's strengthening the profound capacity for renewal and recovery that comes. The Army is data-driven. It is a profoundly innovative, research-based institution. The Army has offices of innovation where they go out and they find the cutting edge. Those generals care about their soldiers. It's as if they're at a Thanksgiving Day table at the head and they have 300,000 soldiers down the sides of the table. There's an avuncular, deep love they have of their soldiers. So when the Army took on this data, they used the science of spirituality, mental health, recovery, renewal, and fitness to integrate the spiritual core as foundational into every sector of the Army. The Army trained all leadership across, from the commanding general down to the company commander, drill sergeants. Now, basic training holds that a soldier must be fit of body, mind, and spirit.
Is there any data that shows that increasing an infantryman's spirituality reduces the incidence of, say, PTSD, depression, or drug addiction in the military? Do you have that data yet?
So there's data when you look, for instance, at vets. Those who engage their spiritual core have a process of post-traumatic spiritual growth. PTSD is not resolved cognitively alone or by medication alone. Trauma is a gateway to an awakening of the spiritual heart. And post-traumatic spiritual growth, there's a beautiful study by Tsai and colleagues, TSAI. They show that for 75% of vets, at the very moment that PTSD is present and the flashbacks and the sleeplessness and the anxiety, there is concomitant, live in that same instant, meaningful growth. We are built to grow through trauma. We are built, as the chief of chaplains, General Tom Soljem says, to be made more inside. It is the truth that in the worst moments of our lives, we are invited to grow the most.
So my last question, we haven't offended somebody. They actually think that maybe spiritual growth would be good for themselves. How do they get started? Read your book?
Well, they're certainly most invited to read The Awakened Brain. And there are practices in there that help people to awaken their natural spirituality. Phil, one of my most cherished mentors was the late Dr. Gary Weaver, and he worked with court-referred boys. He'd been a therapist for young people for 36 years, and he felt his call was to help those boys who, third time before the judge in Salt Lake, had a choice. You go to adult prison now, or you go out to the Moab, the deep desert with Dr. Weaver. And there he shared with them a very simple, beautiful practice in the language of life that awakened their brain. Could we try it? Would you be open to a brief practice?
Sure.
Good. This is a 90-second practice, and I honor the late Dr. Gary Weaver, who gave that to us now. So, Phil, I'm going to invite you to just close your eyes, take 5 breaths, clear out the inner space. I invite you to set before you a table in your inner chamber. This is your table. And to your table, you may invite anyone, living or deceased, who truly has your best interest in mind. Anyone living or deceased who truly has your best interest in mind. And with them all sitting there, ask them if they love you. And now you may invite your higher self, the part of you that is so much more than anything that you have or don't have, you may have done or not done, your true eternal higher self. And ask you if you love you. And now finally, you may invite your higher power, however you know, whatever words are yours, your higher power, and ask them if they love you. With all of those people sitting there right now, what do they need to tell you now? What do they need to share? What do you need to know? When you're ready, I invite you back. This is your counsel, and they are always there for you.
Lisa, thank you for that. And I hope that our listeners also found that personally challenging. Actually, my parents wanted me to be a minister when I grew up. And I used too many four-letter words, and I realized that I had a different calling. But now I've translated my four-letter words into love and that sort of thing. But
heal, that's 4 letters. Good.
The positive four-letter words. Dr. Lisa Miller, thank you for both sharing personal experiences and also the science of your life, guiding us through both achieving awareness, but also awakening awareness. Thank you so much for spending time with us.
It's an honor and a deep, deep joy, Phil. Thank you.
This is Your Brain with Dr. Phil Steig is produced for the Weill Cornell Brain and Spine Center by the Really Interesting Picture Company. The episode producers are Hildy Rubin and Liz Witham. The series is directed and edited by Tom Veltri, with music by Lenny Williams. The announcer is Mindy Weisberger. Sign up for our newsletter and get access to special episode-related bonus content at thisisyourbrain.com and follow us on Facebook at This Is Your Brain.